Good. Keep going, keep going. 10 more sets, 10 more sets. Tough it out, you got it. Keep going, you got it. 10 more reps. Yeah, there we go, perfect. How's it going, guys? It's Austin Yoakum with Yoakum Strength with the first Anatomy Tuesday. We got Mark Amick here, chiropractic student at Northwestern, and today we're going to cover the hamstrings and how to avoid what you just saw on the treadmill.
Yes, so we're going to start by diving into just some basic anatomy. Like you said, start with the hamstring group. So the hamstrings are made up of 3 different muscles. We have from inside to outside, medial to lateral. We have the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris. The semimembranosus and tendinosus are both going to originate at the ischial tuberosity, or your sit bone of your pelvis, and they're going to insert on the medial part of your tibia. And then we have the biceps femoris, which has a long head and a short head, also going to originate up on your sit bone and come down to the lateral part of your leg on your fibula. Now these are 3 big rope-like muscles that cross 2 joints on the back of your leg. They cross the hip joint and the knee joint, meaning that they're going to have 2 actions. From kind of a textbook basic standpoint, their actions are going to be to flex the knee and to extend the hip. And then from kind of a sport performance locomotion standpoint, they're going to serve as a function of an eccentric stabilizer for the knee. So if you're an athlete that's playing a high speed, high velocity, change of direction sport, this is really important. It acts as an eccentric stabilizer, meaning that it's really important from an injury prevention standpoint of stabilizing the knee and the tibia, especially in any tibial translation. So when we talk about the tibia sliding forward across the femur, that's going to be our mechanism of injury when we talk about a torn ACL, especially a non-contact injury like that. So,
the number one question I get with athletes when we discuss the hamstrings is how to avoid looking like that on a treadmill. How do we avoid pulling that hamstring when we run? And the first point I want to bring up is the quad to hamstring ratio. In many programs, in many high school kids, the big thing they focus on, even college kids, is huge quads. They squat a bunch, they do a bunch of unilateral movements just for the quads. And what that does is it builds an imbalance. Our hamstrings are very weak, our quads are very strong, and when we run, we're able to produce a bunch of force with our quads without being able to absorb any force in our hamstrings. What that brings us to is inefficient movement patterns and an anterior pelvic tilt, which Mark is going to talk about.
Yeah, so like you said, inefficient movement patterns. When we talk about having an anterior pelvic tilt, that means that basically when we're standing, our pelvis is shifted forward. What that's going to do is that's going to bring these sit bones up, and it's going to lengthen these muscles. So you have a greater length tension relationship back here, and that's for a lot of athletes are going to have really tight hamstrings. And having tight hamstrings, not being mobile back there, being not flexible is a huge risk of injury. So for that, we want to try to make sure we're getting a neutral pelvis. We want to warm up properly and stay loose and flexible back there.
Yeah, and along with the tight hamstrings, it kind of goes back to the stream theory of not only is it tight hamstrings, but what is causing those tight hamstrings? And the anterior pelvic tilt causes a lot of people, or it's caused by tight hip flexors. So when we sit all day, this is where we see a lot of athletes, we sit all day in this position. And when we stand up, our hip flexors are so tight that we're not really able to come out of that anterior pelvic tilt into a neutral position, and we're stuck like this. When we're stuck like this, we run like that. When we run like that, we put our hamstrings in a very vulnerable spot with the amount of forces that we put through them. This is the third point that we want to talk about is eccentric hamstring strength. The amount of force and how fast that force is put through our hamstrings, no muscle really compares to how much force how much force the hamstrings have to deal with. So when we work on training and programming, we really want to load the eccentric portion of that hamstring. The reason is our eccentric portion of our hamstrings are 20% to 25% stronger than our concentric portions. That allows us to overload our hamstrings into a position that is very similar to our sprinting and jumping and running portions.
Yeah. So like you're saying, when we talk about sport and we talk about injury specifically, really what any injury comes down to, especially any soft tissue injury, is just the body's inability to absorb a force. So eccentric strength is huge, especially when we talk about landing, planting that phase. We want to be able to absorb that force and displace it properly, and those muscles need to be firing fast and efficiently. Okay, now that we've talked about a lot of these problems, let's talk about how to fix these problems. How do we get in the weight room and build bigger, stronger, more resilient hamstrings? It really just comes down to getting in the weight room and attacking the posterior chain and doing a lot of posterior chain type of exercises.
Yeah, and this is where it goes back to the front's for show, the back's for go. If you want to become a better athlete, you really need to focus on that posterior chain. This is where I really challenge people to really take a step and look at your program. How much of it's quad dominant, how much is it posterior dominant? And for many people who open up their eyes to realize they only added in a couple posterior dominant movements to the end of their workout. And not a lot of it is actually really focusing on what we need to focus on to not strain our hamstrings and become better athletes. Two movements that I challenge you guys to focus on is bilateral and unilateral hinge movements. So a hinge is when we're on 2 feet, we're pushing our hips back into it. That's a bilateral hinge. We can do the same thing where we take 1 foot off the ground, now we're in a unilateral stance and we're pushing our hips back.
Yeah, and I think one thing to mention when we talk about these movements is making sure that we're doing these movements with a neutral pelvis. So if we can train our mind and train our body to do all these athletic movements with a neutral pelvis, hopefully that can translate onto the field for sprint mechanics or anything like that.
Yeah, and as a strength coach, what I kind of challenge my athletes is not everything we do on the field and the chaos of the field is going to be perfect, but the more we can make it perfect in the weight room, hopefully the more it transitions to perfect on the field. What we also want to manage with our hamstring strains is how much volume we're using when we're running and sprinting, and then the movement patterns that we talked about earlier. Are we overstriding in our sprints? What is our sprinting mechanics looking like? So really either getting a coach that is able to teach you in your sprinting mechanics, or getting yourself to videotape yourself in your sprinting form, and how are we running? Are we overstriding? Is our foot in front of our hips when we're running? So now we know all this information, we know the problems, and we know really how to attack it. Why as an athlete should I care?
Yeah, when we talk about sports, performance and athletics, it really comes down to force production, power, and this hamstring group is critical for force absorption and force production. So as an athlete, train these muscles, get them stronger, more force production, more power.
Yeah, and along with that, speed is the amount of force you produce and the rate of force you can produce that at. If you get your hamstrings stronger, you're going to be able to absorb and produce more force while you're running, which is in turn going to make you faster. If you're faster, I promise you're going to become a better athlete. And another point I want to bring up is kind of Mike Boyle's quote of, the weight room is very vertical, and sports are very horizontal based. Everything you do in the weight room for the most part, every squat, everything deadlift wise is very vertical. We want to focus on more hinge patterns, anything that's horizontal in the weight room. Focus on those hamstrings, any barbell bridges, that type of thing, broad jumps. Those are going to be very horizontally based, which is hopefully going to allow us to transition to the field. Any sled based movements, anything that transitions to the field better is what's going to key to become athletic performance.
All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. Hope you were able to take away some useful information from this video. We're excited about the project, and we're going to keep working on it.
Yeah, like Mark said, our goal is to put one of these out once a week. So if you guys have anything that you guys want us to focus on, or any questions that you guys have, just put them towards us, and we'll get after it. Keep chopping wood.